The war in Ukraine has caused unprecedented migrations within Europe. And among those millions of migrants were hundreds of thousands of Russians who decided to leave their homeland. A small but significant group among them fled because of Russia's tightening regime. In today's video, experts Maria Domańska and Stefan Ingvarsson explain who are these new emigres and how could they help fight Putin's authoritarian state from the outside.
The West desperately needs to work out a viable long-term strategy vis-à-vis Russia because now we are dealing with the most serious threat to the European security since 1945. I see three pillars of this desired strategy of the West. First is, of course, to support Ukraine as much as we can, as fast as we can, in military, political, and economic terms. Second pillar is to punish Russia for the aggression with current and future sanctions of different kinds. And the third pillar, which is under-discussed even among the expert circles in the West, is the support for the Russian civil society and democratic political groups in exile.
The wave of Russian immigration after the war is estimated at between 600 to 700,000 people. Out of those, a group of between 10 and 15,000 are active in the Russian political sphere or civil society. These are various levels of politicians, independent journalists, civic activists such as lawyers and human rights advocates, as well as artists and writers. What they have in common is their anti-war activism and a desire to try to rebuild democratic civic structures in exile. They continue to have ties with Russia and help those fighting the regime amidst growing repressions. Those in exile still communicate with audiences in Russia, spreading the anti-war message and providing support from abroad. These new Russian emigres reside mostly in the EU, but also in the US, the Southern Caucasus, and Turkey. It is, however, the European Union countries with hubs of Russian immigration, such as Berlin and Vilnius, that host the majority of relocated Russian citizens. And that's why it's increasingly important for European states to work out a consistent strategy of dealing with and supporting emigres as a future strategy vis-à-vis Russia. Arriving in Europe, Russian emigres were met with a number of challenges, which concerned both practical issues and those more complex, like the nature of their activist work.
They were already in a state of exhaustion. They had already lived under a certain stress. And now they came to countries that did not necessarily give them a predictable and understandable framework in terms of visas, work permits, often dealing with the reluctance of European and other migration authorities right now to receive new groups of migrants. And at the same time believing that what they are doing is very important. So a kind of accumulated frustration that they brought with them from Russia, and now a frustration linked to a lot of small petty things linked to establishing a bank account, getting a work permit, and all this red tape has been too much of a focus. And it's partly on our side, I think, to start finding solutions that are more applicable to this group. The challenge has been to find yourself in new circumstances and find ways of starting to work. Also, the actors that were most relevant inside Russia are not necessarily the ones who have found the most fruitful ways of working together with communities that remain inside the country, or finding other activities that are really looking towards the future right now. And a big challenge has been adopting to a reality where you need new methods, new safety concerns, new ways of course, advocating towards the host countries where you're operating, making them understand why what you're doing is important. Explain to them. Explain to European donors what you're doing, and also explain the results that are very difficult to prove. We've also reached a point right now where it's very difficult to show results. So for example, a media outlet that has relocated to the European Union, but has as its primarily goal to target audiences that remain inside Russia, have difficulties improving what kind of, outreach they actually have inside Russia. It's very difficult. And we're at a point where a lot of actors are estimating their outreach based on what they know, but also, you could suspect, to some extent, wishful thinking. And donors and decision makers and hosting countries and collaborating organizations outside of Russia are trusting them because they have been trusted before. So it's a very crucial point right now where tactics need to be developed. Methods of measuring the impact of different activities have to be established because funds are limited and we need to pick and choose what actors, what activities really have an impact on Russia today.
For their host countries, the situation of relocated Russians also proved challenging.
Many countries are not willing to receive large numbers of migrating Russians. This applies specifically to the countries bordering to Russia with certain security concerns, such as Finland, Estonia, Poland, so on. We have to understand these security concerns. So the first challenge is, how do we pick relevant actors? And how do we find a good dialogue between the policy areas in our countries that deal with foreign policy, security, and the policy areas, domestic policy areas that deal with migration? So in countries where this has worked, mechanisms have been found to make lists of strategically important Russian actors, either organizations, news outlets, or concrete individuals, and giving them protection, giving them and their families, which is important because otherwise the families can also be a source of concern for them, but also a source of pressure from the Russian authorities. So it's very important to have a holistic approach to this and give maximum security to those carefully, strategically selected actors. They should also be given some sort of mid-term perspective, not to worry each year about the work permits and the visas, but at least some kind of 2, 3, 4, 5, ideally, year perspective. Then they can start focusing on the actual work. This sounds like I'm dwelling upon details right now, but I would say 80% of all the energy and all the focus in this community has been spent on these practicalities. So it's very important that we find a solution that will make everyone look to what's actually important here, which is the work. Another challenge has been that we have supported actors who were very relevant inside Russia and then relocated, and we have supported them on face value based on the relevance that they had inside the Russian Federation. And this is okay during a crisis situation for a year or two, but we've reached a point where we have to expect new tactics of them. Because just being a formerly important oppositional leader or a recognized independent journalist does not make you a vital, strategic instrument for the future of Russia. So we need to apply these long-term goals that we have towards the developments inside Russia to activities and actors. And this will be a harsh process of measuring and evaluating the actual activities that are being done. Another challenge right now are sources that remain inside Russia. Most of the relocated information and media channels are relying on sources that are inside Russia. They are at extreme risk right now. They're very vulnerable. And should the Russian repression target them specifically, we might lose our only source of knowledge on what's actually going on in Russia through independent media. Unfortunately, we must prepare for a situation where we know less and less, and therefore it's important also to support initiatives of independent social research conducted by relocated Russian social scientists, looking at new ways of examining social development inside Russia from abroad. This requires new methodology. This requires a lot of security concerns regarding who you're interviewing, regarding the reliability of different sources and the information that you're extracting from these methods. This research is extremely important. First of all, because this is the only independent source of information we can have on which activities, which type of actors it's meaningful to support, who has what kind of outreach into the Russian society. It's also a means for the actors themselves to strategically develop their activities, to have something to base the strategic development on. So we're all lacking this knowledge. This is what we lack. We lack the knowledge on what's actually going on inside Russia. So if we're not supporting this type of research, we don't have a full ecosystem, because we will always be guessing. The decision makers, the donors, but also the actors. We will all be guessing on which activities actually have an impact.
While 2022 was a year of establishing themselves in new host countries, this new wave of Russian emigres became more active this year, with different initiatives in the realm of both political and civic activism.
These people focus on several main activities, I would say. First, this is broadly defined help for Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees. Second, they try to save as many people in Russia suffering from repression. So, for example, they work with lawyers on the ground. They work with human rights defenders who have remained in Russia. Also, they publicize the cases of repression. Also, they try to defend those vulnerable, the most vulnerable groups. Within this more politicized sphere, we also have people gathered around the Alexei Navalny structures. We also have many democratic politicians who are active abroad and who try to reach their audiences via internet in Russia. And we see some growing coordination between those broadly defined active political diaspora and also European institutions and European governments. And in June 2023, for example, a dialogue was launched between the European Parliament and other European institutions and representatives of the Russian political diaspora coming from very different circles, very different groups, specializing in different activities. But the idea is to create some broad platform of dialogue and coordination between the European institutions and Russians, who can offer also some food for thought and some interesting solutions for the European Union on how to support themselves, but also on how to support Russians in Russia.
And a piece of advice to the Russian actors themselves. It's very important to advocate your own activities towards the hosting countries, towards the countries in the West and in the European Union. If you are more visible, if what you're doing is more visible, our decision makers will understand the type of challenges, the type of visions, the type of standards that you would like to introduce into the discourse about the future of Russia. Also, a lot of the guessing that's going on right now in the West on the potential future of Russia will be based on a much more qualified analysis. It also has an impact on our own analysis of the future of Russia. Right now, a lot of analysts in the West are speculating, guessing, trying to find ways of creating plausible scenarios for future developments inside Russia, involving Russian voices, professional voices, well-researched voices, well-argued voices into this discussion will deepen our own understanding and will make our predictions more relevant.
While Russian activism abroad will most likely not bring a direct regime change in Russia, supporting them does benefit the West in a number of ways.
Being in exile, they have this opportunity to look closer at European democratic standards, to compare European democratic solutions of all possible kinds with Russian realities and what can be implemented in the future Russia, what cannot be implemented for various reasons. So they can work out quite sober and realistic approach to what can be done in their country once a narrow window of opportunity emerges possibly one day. So they can be sort of a mini laboratory of democratic solutions and patterns to be implemented afterwards in Russia. Also, they can be watchdogs vis-à-vis the future Russian leadership. Even if it is a democratic leadership, this leadership will need to be scrutinized on a regular basis. So people who are not willing to be actively involved in politics, they can serve as this broad group of watchdogs and people who will just show the political leadership where it is wrong, where it is right as regards building democracy or pluralism in a shorter term in Russia. Another important role that they can play currently is to be a conveyor belt vis-à-vis the Russian audiences remaining in Russia. They can disseminate information, the truth about the war, the truth about the crimes of the regime. They can disseminate democratic values. They can disseminate the idea that there can be some kind of political alternative in Russia in the future, and they can do it in an organized, in a more strategic way. I would say that these groups we are talking about can do it in a better, more efficient way because they maintain contacts with their friends, relatives in Russia and broader Russians audiences. They have still insight into political and social developments. They can serve to us as a very important source of information about social mood in Russia, especially in regions, especially at a local level. We don't have much tools to analyze it ourselves. So I think that as long as these people still feel the pulse of what is happening in Russia, they can feed us with information, with their interpretations of certain processes, with their reflection on what is happening and what should be done in the future. And then they can tremendously help us to work out our own strategic approach vis-à-vis Russia in a longer term, which is desperately needed.
In the end, however, it's only Russia itself that is responsible for its own independence. Any support from the West can work as a catalyzer for this shift, but also help in keeping Europe safe.
I see it as a part of our broader strategy vis-à-vis Russia, and I see this support as an instrument to increase European security in the future mostly, to dismantle this kind of regime in Russia, to weaken it, and to promote democratic ideas as in fact something that will serve European security. Our ambition cannot be to make Russia a democratic country because it would require many years. I would say this is a project for generations to make Russia a viable democracy. But what is realistic in a shorter term is to make Russia more pluralist and then less aggressive, because we need some minimum scrutiny vis-à-vis the future political leadership so that a bunch of people cannot take crucial decisions overnight without any control from anyone. So that's why I would say that everything that serves this goal is serving the goal of a safer Europe. And now we have, of course, short-term goals and long-term goals vis-à-vis Russia. Our long-term goals should be to make Russia more citizen-friendly, I would say, because now we see that this regime is extremely oppressive and the value of human life in Russia is extremely low, which we see on the front line, for example. But also, there are many other things that, in fact, underpin this regime and guarantee some kind of basic popular support for this regime. So basically, our goal should be to dismantle the three pillars of Putinism. I would point to the over-centralization of the state power, the political disempowerment of citizens, and also the lack of confrontation with totalitarian past. So again, we should think in a longer term, and we should look at the system as a whole, and we should focus on these long-term goals to promote more democratic ideas and to compromise, in fact, the autocratic ideas. So first of all, a discussion is needed in Russia about what happened in the past. There was no Nuremberg trials in the case of the Soviet Union, and this has long-term results also now, because people in Russia don't realize what precisely the Soviet Union was as a political system. Every attempt to compare directly the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany are punished by Russian criminal code, for example, with 5 years in prison even. So a very painful discussion about it will be needed. Also, we have to restore the value of human life in Russia so that mass war crimes or sending soldiers as cannon fodder to the front line in the aggressive war could be just impossible in the future. Above all, we should restore the value of politics as a non-violent sphere of struggle for interest and promoting needs of different groups in the society.
There is, of course, the question of how much should we try to instruct or frame what Russian relocated actors are doing. And I think this question is important to raise because I think a lot of listeners out there will think about this when they listen to us. I would say each euro that is spent from our side should expect inclusion, democratic standards, but it should also expect not only inclusion and diversity from a point of view of justice, but also from a point of view of the quality of the visions that are being formulated. Because if very similar people coming from one environment in Moscow or St. Petersburg are sitting around one table formulating visions of a future Russia, these visions will not hold as much as visions formulated by a round table that includes people from other parts of Russia, other generations, minority perspectives, vulnerable groups. Bringing all of these other voices to the table also sharpens the question of the challenges that Russia is facing. Each person with another perspective makes the vision sharper.
So we should focus on all of that, and in the West we should understand, figure out how we can contribute to these processes, which will not be easy. There is of course no ironclad guarantee of success here, but it deserves an organized attempt at least. And here the exiled communities, people who understand the very nature of this regime, who are against this regime, against the war, can be our allies, and we should somehow join forces to organize these narratives, this discourse, in a way that can more efficiently reach Russian audiences.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing to our channel to be notified about new stories from the region.